All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Laura Brennan Bissell. It's August 5th, 2024. We're in Underwood, Washington. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
First question, why wine?
Oh, yeah. The answer for that is usually, the shorthand answer is that I like the way things smell, which is true. I've always been very almost like synesthetically driven through my nose. My relationship with smell, like from as far back as I can remember, is really strong and profound. And it pulled me in. I think that my earliest wine memory was I was in kindergarten, and I was at my best friend's house, whose family was Hungarian. And her parents, they were like considerably cultured people. You know, they went to the symphony, and they had nice art in their house, and she was a good cook, and they ate good food. And I remember my family going over for dinner there one night, and their parents had opened a bottle of wine. And there was another family over there as well, but they were talking about the wine and smelling the wine. I mean, my own parents had no idea what was going on, but hearing them communicate about something solely through their smelling of it, it fascinated me. Like, even as a little kid, I wanted to know what that was. I wanted to understand what sensory object got to live its life through people's olfactorum, you know. So that's what drew me into wine. I never perceived that one could be a winemaker. I'd never, when I was like, gee, what do I want to do with my life? Winemaker wasn't something that I realized was even on the docket. I grew up in Virginia, which was not really a wine region at the time. It was a couple hundred years prior, but, when I was growing up, that wasn't much of a thing there. Definitely wasn't much of a thing in my world. But the next profoundly strong wine memory I have was in high school. My boyfriend at the time and I worked at a nice hotel. And he and I both just kind of decided that we liked wine. And he worked in the in-room dining office, which was right by where they stored the wine. So sometimes end up coming home with bottles of wine. And we just sit on my rural Virginia, colonial house front porch and rock in chairs and drink wine and pretend that we knew what we were talking about. And, this would be Chateau Ste. Michelle or Jekyll Merlot or cake bread or God knows what, Clos du Bois. And I liked it. And I liked that it was something you talked about. I don't know, So that continued as an interest, never really learning much about wine outside of, maybe for a 17-year-old, I knew more varieties, but I didn't know much about what they meant until kind of fast forward, be about 5-6 years. I ended up moving out to the Bay Area, and something that people always get confused in my story is they're like, she was a tattoo artist. I was never a tattoo artist. Never happened. I moved to the Bay Area to apprentice to tattoo from someone and kind of pretty quickly decided that wasn't really what I wanted to do with my life. But I lived out here, at that point, I think I was in the Bay for maybe 6-8 months, and I was working at a beer bar in Berkeley, and this very handsome gentleman came in one night and sat down and had a beer in the back and was smoking a cigarette, and I was getting off work and got myself a beer and went and bummed a cigarette for the excuse of talking to him. And as I sat down and I was like, well, what do you do? And he said, I'm a winemaker. And it was this realization that like people could be winemakers. Like, oh, you could be a portrait painter, you could be a jockey, you could be all of these ideas that in my life never existed as options, but you could be a winemaker. Wow. And he actually ended up being a kosher Orthodox winemaker, and we became really good friends. But it was the first kind of opening of that, even as an option. And over the next few months, we drank wine together and talked, and, you know, I started to learn about wine, and this is like 2006, 7-ish. So it was like Southern Rhone wines were what I was drinking, because you could still get like Gigondas and Larocque and Tavel and stuff like that for sub $20 and get something that was okay. And I started going into a wine shop in Berkeley called Vino, and, you know, most wine shops at that point, if I walked in there, I was like a black metal punk rock kid. Like, people would look at me like I was going to steal something, you know. But this one guy, Perry, at Vino in Berkeley, was Piedmont, so Oakland technically, was really kind and talked to me about, you know, the different wines and kind of coached me through them. And I learned a ton from him, and the winemaker who I had met is named Jonathan Haydu, who's a super interesting person. I mean, he's the winemaker now for Covenant, and has been for years, which is a kosher project from Napa, and where they're based in Berkeley. And then he has his own label, Haydu and Brodignagian. But he, up until this day, he's still a dear friend of mine. And I wish I knew where Perry was, but I don't. But Jonathan and I still call each other every year around harvest, and a couple other times to check in, or, you know, if one of us is looking at a vineyard that we think the other one might have worked with or something like that, we, you know, just ask about our families and everything. We've known each other for a long time now. So it's like going on, you know, 15, 16 years. So, yeah, that's how, why. The why is, from there it was, I went and traveled around Asia for quite some time, and that was just by chance that I was able to do it. You know, I didn't have money at all, but I had been hit by a car in San Francisco. It was like a San Francisco city vehicle, like nearly crushed me on a track bike, and by weird chance, one of the deputy city attorneys of San Francisco was standing right there, like watching it happen. So I had worked for a lawyer when I was younger, like in high school, actually. I worked for a lawyer, and I knew how to write motions and things like that. So I like wrote a claim against the city, and they didn't fight with me much. And it wasn't for a ton of money or something. I think I got like $18,000 or whatever, but I was, you know, 23, 24 at that time. And I was like, I have never left America. Like, outside of walking over the border into Mexico, went on tour with the black metal band. So I went, and I was gone for about 6 months and traveled like through Southeast Asia, and then spent most of the time in Nepal and India. Got a job working in PR from that, which was kind of funny. I mean, this guy I knew from bicycling, 'cause I was a bike messenger when I was much younger. So this guy I knew from bicycle stuff, I was sending these emails about my journey, like my story, to all my friends, kind of like this was blog era, but for me, I didn't know about blogs. I didn't know about the internet. So it was like kind of like a blog that I just sent to my friends. And he was like, hey, you're a really good writer. Do you want a job working in PR and marketing? And, you know, to me, I was like, shit, I'm coming back from this trip, and I used up most of my funds at this point. And a job and whatever sounds great. I was like, yeah, I'll take the job. And he's like, okay, cool. You know, let me know when you're back. You know, as soon as we are finished this conversation, I'm like, Google, what is PR and marketing? You know? So, that's, you know, that came to be. And, I worked in that industry for a couple of years, when I got back, as well as like touring with bands. And
Touring with bands in what way?
oh, it was like a merch lady. Yeah, I mean, I play music too, so I did sometimes play shows and stuff as well, but like more like solo acoustic stuff. But yeah, so I came back, did that for a while. Decided that I didn't want to work in the bicycling industry anymore because there was no money, and it was just, I don't know, it wasn't calling me. And I had a party with one of my friends, and we used to throw these crazy dinner parties like with themes, and this was called like Le Dinner Party, and it was like duck confit for like 70 people. And at that party I just remember throwing up a glass of like shitty Malbec. No, it was Minervois. Anyway, just saying I'm gonna ride my bike into France and learn to make wine from someone. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And the next day, quite hungover, I woke up and booked a flight and flew into Barcelona like a month and a half maybe later with my bicycle, and not nearly enough money to do what I had planned on doing, and was met with a cold reality that traveling in Europe was a lot more expensive than traveling around India. And started teaching English illegally in Barcelona so that I could survive. And I did that, and I, had all sorts of other creative hustles on the side.
Why was it illegal?
Because I didn't have a worker's permit.
Oh,
yeah.
Just illegal to work in general.
Yes.
Not okay.
Yes. Undocumented.
Not specifically to teach English.
Working. Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, not illegal English. That's something else. But yeah, so I did that. I like kind of found these interesting niches. Like I've always liked working with kids. I love children. And I would teach English to kids and chefs. So like I'd meet, at La Boqueria in the morning and like go to Pinocho and eat some cigrons or like a chucho if I was really hungover. And, then we just walk around the market and translate from Catalan or Spanish into English and talk about food. So it's kind of a cush situation. And then with children, I mainly went out to Sant Cugat, which is like the rich area. One of my friends hooked me up. You taught English out there. You made like twice as much as you did in the city. I mean, I was still making just enough to survive. But yeah, in that period, I met a gentleman who grew up in Barcelona. And we fell madly in love. And, we're together for almost a couple years and fought a lot and ate a lot of good food and drank a lot of good wine and had this I can't think of who the author would be, but it was very much like a kind of like a statement piece of life of where we both were. I mean, he's to this day probably the most well-read and cultured person I've ever met. And at that time I was also doing a lot of performance poetry and kind of performance art and music and stuff when I was living in Spain. We lived in this little beautiful light-filled apartment on Madrazo Street and, right by the market. And, our house was always filled with music or fighting in music or, but it was very passionate and very, I don't know, it was great. It was exactly what I needed in my mid to late 20s. And his family was super into food and wine. It was kind of like a contest between him and his father of who could find the best, Michelin restaurant in a random village, in the Basque Country or in La Rioja. And we kind of just traveled around Catalonia and, La Rioja and ate really good food. And, no one was super into wine yet at that point, but enough that we drank good wine. When he and I inevitably split up, I went and lived with this guy who had become a really good friend of mine there, who was this Basque man, this big, giant, hilarious Basque man, who was also really into food and wine and gin tonics and God knows what else. And we just, again, it was kind of we just raised hell together. And, he lived in this crazy, 5-floor up stone old apartment in the Gothic Quarter, and we were just, bon vivants, essentially, and again, just tons of great food and wine. And cocktails, so many cocktails, and I had this great experience there. I never went and learned to make wine on my bicycle from anybody in France, but I ended up spending a lot of time in Austria as that was happening too, because I had gone over there to play a concert and met a gentleman from Vienna and had my Viennese affair that I'd fly back and forth with. I mean, I'm so happy I had this experience in my life. But it was also, it was tumultuous, it was hard. But like looking back on it, I'm kind of like, that's cool. And then I decided it was time to go back to America and actually get a real job. And there I could legally work in a winery, because they're pretty strict about letting you work in wineries in Europe if you don't have a permit. So I wrote a resume of wine experience that was completely bullshit, and I applied at a bunch of different wineries, and I got callbacks from like pretty legit, like Chateau Montelena got back to me, and they're like, you don't have enough experience maybe for this harvest, but we like your spirit, keep in touch. Oren Swift at the time, which was still not completely purchased, got in touch with me. I almost worked with them, and that was a relationship that I stayed in contact with their winemaker for quite some time, who's a really cool guy, and they had even reached out to me later on about getting into operations. Had I done that, I probably would have bought a bigger property with more vines at this point. but I didn't. I decided I was going to start my own winery. And I ended up taking a job with this winery in Dry Creek Valley called Unti, which was an organic, biodynamic certified vineyard. And that was what had interested me in that. It was all estate, which was also interesting, which meant that I got to be in the vineyards as well. And I really wanted to understand that side of it. And the winemaker was a French guy from, he was from Montpellier, named Sebastian Pouchon, who I'm still friends with. Lovely, lovely human, great winemaker. I showed up there and had absolutely no idea what I was doing, and I think he knew what he was getting into. In hindsight, he confirmed that. Wiggled my way through a wine harvest, and pretty quickly was like, well, this is hard work, but it's also not rocket science, so if I'm going to do this, I want to do it for myself. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm going to start my own winery.
What year was that first harvest?
12. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 12. No, that was 11. So the first year I made wine was 2012, which was laughable because I was totally broke and had no resources. It was like on like food stamps and Medi-Cal, and had decided that I wanted to go to school for a while because I wanted to be a neuroscientist. I dropped out of high school. I had no academic background or prowess, but I like brains. I still do. I would say it's still something that I kind of maybe regret a little bit not finishing, like not sticking with it. But it was kind of like, go to college for like 10 plus years to maybe not get to study what I want and work in someone else's lab potentially, or become a winemaker, which I can see happening. So I tried to straddle both for a while, and then in 2000, I made wine in 12 with the help of Jonathan Haydu, the kosher winemaker, who basically didn't let me make any excuses to not make wine that year. He was like, you can have a half ton of fruit. Here's a barrel. You can do it in my winery. Don't make any more excuses. Like, you're making wine this year. You're going to be good at it. And so I did that. And then in 13, I had been working at a little wine bar in California and got to go to tastings and started curating the list there. I went to a tasting, and I had heard of this guy, Steve Mathiasen, but didn't really know much about him. I think I had tried his Linda Vista Chardonnay, which was this entry-level Chardonnay. And I was at this tasting and at his table, and he poured me a glass or a taste, and I was like, oh, this is corked. And I didn't even think about it, and he was like, that's unlikely because I just bottled it. And then he smelled the wine. He's like, oh, you're right, it's corked. And like, it wasn't like I wasn't trying to be like a know-it-all or anything. It was just this, but it was like a weird icebreaker. So we started chit-chatting, and I basically was like, hey, can I work for you? And he was like, why don't you come out to Napa? And, you know, we'll see. And I was like, okay, cool. So I drove out to Napa one day, and I mean, this is when the Mathiasons were still like really just getting started. You know, it was like him, Jack Roberts, Jill, his wife, and they had a lady named Sean who was working for them too, doing like wine club stuff. But it was a tiny operation. Yeah, I got out there and jumped in the car with Steve, and we drove to one of the vineyards he works with. And I remember having conversations about petrichor and different smells and sensory experiences with wine, and just kind of looking at this person who was much further along in their career than me and being kind of mesmerized of how curious he still was. And, you know, just really appreciated that. Like, and not just curious in his own regard, but also curious what someone like me who had no fucking idea what I was talking about was thinking or experiencing. And it was nice. And I you know, kind of in that moment was like, yeah, I do want to learn from this person. And I mean, my harvest working for them that year was really just driving all over California and sampling fruit from, you know, the innumerable vineyards they were working at. So, which sounds like, I feel like this is one of those moments in life where, and Steve and I have had this conversation, where experiences are 100% what you make of them. You know, there's many people who probably would have been like, oh, I'm just driving all over hot-ass California in the middle of harvest and picking fruit and sampling it and, you know, like processing the numbers. Like, what am I going to learn doing that? And for me, it was like, I'm driving to all these crazy vineyards all over California and getting to see the viticulture and how they're growing and the soils and how different things ripen, you know, the difference between the pH and the sugars in this place versus that place. And, you know, it was fascinating. And then getting to do that and ask Steve about why and how and what, and it was this phenomenal experience where I just learned a ton. You know, and then I made wine that year too, and that was fantastic because I was you know, this idiot kid making my second vintage of wine. I had Steve Mathiason and Jack, you know, who had worked with him for a while and was starting his own label too. They have Keep in California, him and his wife JJ. And then, you know, Jonathan Haydu, who I was still in the same cellar as. And then the head winemaker for that winery that we were both custom crushing at was called Falcor, which is still in Napa. I've made my wine there for over a decade. Their winemaker, this guy Fernando Castro, who's to me like an unsung hero of Napa, like was just a fantastic winemaker. I mean, he and I, it took years before we got close, but eventually he started, you know, like he kind of cellar mastered for me as well. But just, he's like, there's all these really cool lifers in the wine industry who work in the cellars and understand how everything works and are the nuts and bolts of it all that just never get the attention. And that's the one for me that was, you know, I mean, he's been paramount to this day, you know. And yeah, so that's how, it's a really long story. That's how I got into wine.
There's a lot of interesting side hustles along the way there that I'm dying to ask about.
Oh, so many side hustles.
Tell me some of the stories from that time that stick out to you, wine wise or otherwise, from those kind of the years either in Spain or back in California. What were the moments that kind of drove you forward? What were the things that, I don't know, that were encouraging to you or that push you in a certain direction?
I would say, I mean, Jonathan, my friendship with Jonathan from early on, you know, like, this is such a critical, like, there's like, I feel like I'm perceived maybe by others as someone who like has a lot of confidence or something like that. And whatever confidence I have is not anything that I have like articulated together. Like, it's maybe just something that I got stamped with, because as a person, I actually have fucking crippling imposter syndrome and never feel like I'm good enough and never feel like I do anything well enough. And it's like a paradox, because the way I'm perceived, I'm a personality where people wouldn't think that they would need to encourage me or tell me that I'm good at something. They'd be like, well, she knows she's good at this, but I don't. And I think that having these critical people along the way who have said you can is just so vital. And I try and do that myself when I can, to other people who, be it wine or something else in their life. Just letting people know you see them and that you believe in them is really important. Because that's definitely been like vital for me in the experience of becoming like a winemaker. I mean, I've had, like when I wanted to come back to California to learn to make wine, everyone told me I was crazy. Everyone told me I couldn't do it. Everyone told me that, you can't just, you need to go to school, or like you don't even know what you're talking about, or whatever, And there was this one chef who I taught English to, named, I butchered his name recently, but it's Jose Alvarez. And he had a restaurant, still has one in Barcelona, called Can Vallès. And if you live in Barcelona, you know about Can Vallès. It's booked every night. That they keep the door locked. You can't even walk in. But it's not like on the, maybe it's on the Michelin or slow food list now, but it just, the food is incredible. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. But they've never needed to play the game. They did it. And he became this like really sweet, lovely person in my life. Him and his wife, like I just, we'd walk around the markets, or sometimes I'd go meet them at their apartment, and I told him I wanted to come be a winemaker, and he was just like, you can do it. Like, you can totally do this, Laura. Like, you have, like, you understand flavors and smells, and, you can totally be a winemaker. And it was kind of like, duh, to him. And I was like, okay, and then my friend Jonathan from the very beginning, told me that I had a good palate and that I could smell well, and, understood different things about wine and science, and kind of the crossover of where creativity and science meet in wine. And then, moving forth, like I remember one day, I think it was Harvest 2013, maybe 14. But it was like during Harvest, because in 14 I worked for the Mathiasens a little bit too, and I worked at this wine bar, and I was trying to go to school for a lot of, 13 and 14. So I was sleeping like 3 hours a night and just completely dogging myself out. I got, I like woke up at 8 o'clock in the morning or something, exhausted, getting ready to drive to Napa, and I just got this text from Steve out of nowhere that was like, like, it's people like you that make the wine industry exciting. I can't wait to see what you do. And Steve's a really sincere person, and he's a very kind person, but he doesn't just delve out the compliments either, so getting something like that from him, like, I don't think he knows how important that text message was to me, but it was just kind of out of nowhere. And yeah, so I definitely, there's all sorts of little moments in life. I mean, recently I was in, like this whole project has been devastatingly complicated, and everyone's struggling financially in the wine industry, and we're not part of that. I mean, we're still selling some wine, but it's like, it's a bottleneck, it's a correction. Everyone's going through something right now. But this project in its own sense has had a lot of outside complications in reaching fruition, which we're about to release the wine, so that's very exciting. But I was in New York for work, and I went out and had lunch with Eric Asimov, who, through just wine in general, has kind of become a really sweet, wonderful friend. And I love spending time with people like him, because it's like we talk about wine a little bit, but then we're talking about life, and we're talking about culture, and we're talking about all sorts of other things. I mean, he and I both train in martial arts. Like he does a collection of Japanese martial arts, and I do jiu-jitsu. So, there's that. There's like, we talk about classical music. His son, studied that, and it's beautiful to have those just bridges of relationships. But the thing that happened in that conversation in particular was I opened up about this sense of imposter syndrome and kind of the vulnerability about everything with this project. And even having someone like him say, like, yes, I also have imposter syndrome sometimes, like, was so, I don't know, like, real and beautiful and sincere, and I feel like this is an interesting industry where it's like every moment I get to the point where I'm like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I have a conversation like that with someone who just inspires me. And I don't know if there's many other worlds like that. Like just not even a month ago, I was pouring at a wine festival called Blood of the Gods in Walla Walla, which was amazing. I mean, it was like, talk about intersectionalism of my life. I mean, it's like a heavy metal and wine festival. Like, I couldn't have made it up myself.
You could not be at that.
Yeah, no, for sure. It was. I mean, and it was also just quality wine and good music, and like it was just so well done. But Dan Petrosky, who does Massican in California, who's also been a really wonderful sounding board for me through the last several years of my career, was there, and I hadn't seen him in a couple years, and I love Dan, and it was just one of those same moments of, I am at this interesting crossroads as a winemaker, and, I've gone through, like, the analogy I give people is the experience of Homer Simpson going out to the desert when he, like, talks to the coyote and stuff. That's kind of been the last few years of my winemaking life, where I've had to go in and go out and go in and go out and decide if I align with all of this still, and, think about climate change and think about my family and think about my own health and what this all means at this point. And then you still have these moments where you sit down with someone like Dan and you drink too many martinis and you have a wonderful meal and you just say, what else would I be doing? Like this is magical. And I think that's part of what, this whole table of really wonderful wine people were talking about that night, is the kismet nature of, how it pulls people in like that. So I hope that answers the question.
More than even a little bit. Yeah, that's a great answer. So let's talk about the growth then. You mentioned you saw right away that if you were going to do wine, you wanted to start your own thing, which is
sure.
So tell me about starting your own thing, choosing everything, choosing what kind of wine to make and what the ethos of the brand was going to be and all of that. Tell me about kind of getting that started and how that came to be.
Sure. So from the beginning, I wanted to make organic wine. Can't say exactly why, but wine, food, all of it, I guess when I think of things in my life, they're a cycle. I can't think of a glass of wine without being like, well, where did that come from? Who made it? How was it made? Where did it grow? What was it growing in? How did that happen? How was it treated? How is the land there? What lives there? And I've been that way since I was pretty young. I mean, I started wanting to go get food at health food stores when I was a little kid, and my parents were just like, what are you? By the time I was in high school, I was like going and shopping at health food stores by myself and, knew about grass-fed meat and, wanted to be eating things that were healthier. Could have told you about the omega fatty acid content. Like I was concerned. It seemed off to me to not be thinking about where food comes from. So transitioning into wine it was just there already. That of course I want to drink wine that's from organic grapes. Of course I want to make wine in the cellar that's not super manipulated. I did, there have been periods in my life where I have worked with vineyards that were in transition or transitioned vineyards from organic. I think that's really important. I almost feel like there's a duty we owe our children to almost be the consumers of the transition crops, like to be the poison eaters, to get the world to a better place. Like, it may sound like some weird dark shit, but I think there's a responsibility. I mean, really, if we could just get the baby boomers to do it, that'd be the best. But, but yeah, I'm pretty much a zealot at this point about regenerative farming, and not in a way where I can't sit in a room and understand other people's perspectives and hear them out and not function in judgment, but in a way where I will use whatever patience and consciousness I have inside of me to help other people understand the importance of what we're putting into the ground and what we're putting into our bodies and the long-term importance of that, and how unless there's just this massive shift, we're kind of screwed. Not kind of. I mean, I am a firm believer that we're like in the sixth extinction right now. Like, it's already begun. Things are kind of like, there's no precipice anymore. Like, now we're just figuring out how to do the best in this position of decline. So that's why I make organic wine. But the cellar side, I guess I was indoctrinated pretty early into we'll call it natural wine 1.0, which is very different than what it has become now, where it wasn't a flavor base profile thing of, oh, this smells and tastes like a natural wine. It was like, this is the way these winemakers are doing it because it's the right thing, and it wasn't a dogma around sulfur or anything. It was just like native fermentations, organic farming, little manipulation, only what's necessary. And that also felt right. I think it's also the way I feel about cooking. Mm-hmm. If you have really good ingredients, salt and some spices should do the job. You don't need to be adding, Caro syrup or MSG or things like that. I mean, unless you're making very specific foods like pecan pie, which needs Caro syrup. But it's, just the cleanness and the lack of manipulation spoke to me. And honestly, I've never even inoculated a fermentation. Like, I don't know how to do it. There's all these conversations about nutrients and yan and blah, 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 blah. And I think that for the most part, wine can be made clean and beautiful without really messing with it too much. Mm-hmm. I love sulfur. I don't use a ton of it, but I think it's wonderful preservative. Even though I personally have a histamine reaction to it, I still think that as far as the things that you can do to make a wine beautiful and clean, it's the main one. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of like one of the best analogies I've heard, which was from my distributor in California by proxy of a French winemaker, and I can't remember who it was that using the right amount of sulfur is kind of like cleaning the windows on a house. Like, you can see inside finally. And you don't need to use tons of it, but just enough. Mm-hmm. I'm not a dogmatic winemaker at all, but I'm definitely and I feel like my wines show that. I have really delicate, beautiful wines that are structured, and it's because I subscribe that way philosophically.
So tell me about the first couple efforts at making wine. What were the biggest learning curves? What were the biggest gaps for you?
Using enough sulfur. Yeah. Yep, that was number one, straight out of the gates. And I remember Jonathan talking to me about it and being like, you definitely have to use it to crush, Laura, and then Steve had a heart-to-heart with me when I was vacillating in my head about it, where he basically was like, are you going to be the type of winemaker that will go down with your ship when you make bad wine? And kind of made some examples for me that I was like, okay, Steve. Like, no, I don't want to be that kind of winemaker. So we've had some talks about that. And in farming too, I feel like sulfur is the most affordable prophylactic you have against a lot of vineyard disease. It can mess with some insect population and stuff like that, but I think that there's a balance there. I'd love to be rich enough that I can just spray gold bullion in my vineyards and not have to worry about, hurting anything ever. But there's also, there's a sustainability in being able to pay your bills. I use very little sulfur out there too. I'm mainly I spray lupin seed oil and cinnamon oil and fermentations and stuff like that for the most part, but I still have to be conscious.
So let's talk about the farming side. Tell me about, you mentioned the vineyard was an important piece for you, getting to be in the vineyard, getting to know the vineyard. Tell me about developing that regenerative farming philosophy and starting to implement it.
In California, that was it was like if I could get my hands on an organic vineyard or, lease it or get the grower to agree to let me farm it and trade or something. That was really important. Learning about the sprays and stuff from Steve was super helpful. When I started to transition up here, I actually had been advised to reach out to Mimi Castillo, which I did. And then Mimi has become a very dear and important person to me as far as understanding the regenerative farming. Mimi's continued to be, we talk, I would say every 6 months or something at this point maybe, but it's always like, it's like checking in with my big sister or something, I absolutely love her. That, and, becoming familiar with places like Piscinas Ranch and, animal integration and really learning more about soil biology. There's a guy named John Kempf I really like, who's like a very intelligent farmer as far as how different minerals and whatnot affect the farming process. He has a great podcast. I think it's called the Regenerative Farming Podcast. It's been my farming, I feel like, has been gleaned from people who I look up to and admire and feel like understand things. But I'd say at this point, after having had my own farm for, a handful of years, it's largely influenced by the nature that I experience and see around me. I'm always doing different weird experiments. Like this year I didn't tie. I pruned really late as well, so I haven't really suckered much either. I have some mildew. It's not overwhelming. One of my vineyards, the Albarino, which is my biggest, I don't have, knock on wood, any mildew right now. I do things like that. And like the theory for that was like, wait, if I don't tie, it's a high humidity, like wet spring here. The reason people tie is to like stop from breakage and, control the growth of the vine. It's like, well, if I'm not tying, then when it's windy, the vines are moving more and shaking, maybe there'll be less precipitation that can, residually build up on them. And then also what I've experienced from doing this on a smaller scale before was the fruit was going higher up in the canopy, but on its own by not being tied. Like the vines kind of climb up higher, which I would assume is somewhat of a preventative from mildew, but also moving into like the vine on its own would grow in a way that would be better for animal integration. Like grapes, if you let them be, climb 30 feet up into trees and they're fruiting way higher. We have an issue with animal integration in conventional, not organic, but in in modern senses of viticulture, because of what we do to the vine by keeping it low and keeping the fruit low, not because that's what the vine would do on its own. So trying to learn things like that. I don't trap for gophers at all anymore. And up here, that's like, I could be burned at the stake for saying that around here. Because I joke that like we have like soil that gophers could like do the backstroke through. It's like 30 feet of this basalt pebbly loam. So it's very easy for them to move around. But what I've noticed is that if I don't mow and I don't interfere, it's just less hospitable for them. So what will happen is in the beginning of spring, when all the snow melts, I will have an absolute meltdown and look around and see all the gopher mounds in my vineyard, like everyone else around here, because you can't gopher trap in the winter. And then everyone starts frantically mowing around me, and the gophers move out of my vineyard and go to theirs. And I'm like, the reason they're doing this is to not have gophers, but I'm telling you, I can see like they don't like it. And I've had all these different philosophies of why that is. My theory for a while was that when the grasses get really high, they can't, like I was thinking maybe it's like a vitamin D synthesis thing, where like if they come up, their fur can't absorb enough vitamin D, because if you go into the forest, you don't see gopher mounds in the middle of the trees. You see them, on the hillsides, or, where there's little valleys. And that may have something to do with it. But then I was also talking to like the livestock management professor for Cal Poly for a long time. I was talking to him about it, all of my gopher theories, which when you get around ag people, these are long conversations. And I was like, maybe it's the high grasses. And he's like, that's exactly what it is. He's like, because when the birds hunt, they, like, contrary, like everyone's like, oh, you have to keep your grasses low so the owls and the hawks can see the gophers. And it's like, well, guess what? Owls and hawks have been around a lot longer than lawnmowers, and that's not how they hunt. They hunt by watching the grasses move. So when you have higher grasses, the gopher comes up, it moves. It's like if there's a red tail or a kestrel or anything anywhere near, it's going to see that and go for it. And then the interesting thing with voles is you see a lot of vole girdling and, drought times around here too. I have, I'm sure, a metropolis of vole before me, but because there's also tons of native grasses, I don't seed either, just all volunteer. There's tons of native grasses that seed and, whatnot. They have plenty to eat and drink for most of the year. Like there's, precipitation that builds up in the bottom layer because it's not bare dirt. So they're, they have water they can get from that. And then, they have plenty to eat. So they're not really, the vines are like, when you see the most girdling in a vineyard, it's when there's nothing else for the other animals and critters to eat, or it's a really bad drought year. Or, the flip side of that is if you've just planted, like my whole theory here if I just planted a vineyard, I would be functioning a little bit more differently as far as like trapping gophers and whatnot. And I probably would make sure I planted like moisture retaining cover crops enough that the other things had something to eat too. So
well, before we move you up here, let's talk about the kind of the growth in California. So tell me about the growth of your brand. Actually, let's talk about your brand name first.
Okay.
And then talk about the growth of your brand in California and what were the sort of the significant milestones for you, growth milestones for you.
So Inconnu, I'd say 14 was like the vintage where I actually made like 1,000 cases or something of wine. So that was a big deal. And then, I finally released the brand in 16, in 17, 18. I would say like by 2017 into 2018, Inconnu was like kicking up a lot of attention in California, or as a California wine. And by 18 doing really well. And then there's this whole chapter of non-disclosure. But I ended up here and, had the intention of having a 50-50 attention, and then COVID happened and everything kind of shifted, and Inconnu, I still maintain doing Inconnu, but it's been, it's a challenge with young children and everything to go back and forth. But yeah, I would say that it's kind of like a funny, like, I got to like pole position and then I jumped to come up here. And then there was this multi-year period of stuff. And I bought my own farm in 2021 and still was dealing with the multi-year period of stuff. And now, ta-da! I can release my first vintage. So, if that makes sense.
It makes enough sense. So,
Yeah.
so tell me about, you mentioned kind of hitting the market and kind of making some noise in California, or as a California brand. Tell me about that. Tell me about what was drawing people in and what was the kind of, what was the feedback you were getting?
So it's funny. I feel like there's a kestrel right there. They're one of my most favorite birds to watch hunt. Like, they're just so beautiful. Coming out of the gates, I'm a relatively young lady covered in tattoos. So I got a lot of attention for the whole natural wine world thing, which is funny because that's not who I am or what I've done, as far as being a winemaker, really. But I subscribe to low intervention winemaking and organic farming. So I'm not part of, I would say, 1.0 or even 2.0, but whatever is happening now. I'm definitely making different wine than that. But I make really traditional, like, old school style Cabernet and Merlot for the most part in California. Like, that's what I do. It's what I've done from the beginning. And people who like classical wines have always acknowledged that. And it's kind of this funny thing of, I almost feel like I've had to like fight the more attention getting part of being a winemaker, and that, like, when people want to make you the it girl or throw your like brand, like your personal brand on things, when what I do as a winemaker is very subtle. So the attention kind of came from the crossroads of that, I would say. Some of it was from like the cool natural wine people, but some of it was like master sommeliers and, like masters of wine and people who really appreciate the traditional like 70s style of California that is what put us on the map. Or people, like I tend to do well with like an old world gravitational crowd. And that the wines are solid and put together but also restrained and delicate.
Okay, so you're talking about the kind of the growth in California. Tell me about as you're changing, as things are coming in. Tell me about why this was the next step. What you were looking for as the second step.
Yeah, I mean, this is the most interesting and compelling place to make wine in America, as far as I'm concerned, and maybe one of the most interesting in the world. I get 42 inches of rain. I'm at 1,700 feet elevation. I can dry farm. I have volcanic soil. There's tons of wind. As we can hear, see, the wind is responding. It's like, this is why.
You summoned it.
No, it's not hard to do here. Really, all you have to do is live here. The wind is all the time. No, it's a super interesting place to make wine. I mean, the Tempranillo, for example, is so much lighter and crisper than most Tempranillo you get. I have some other wines from up here we can taste, but it's just, the terroir is unreal. This high acid, mineral driven thing, which I feel like is what I've chased as a winemaker for the majority of my career, is acidity, mineral content, phenolic ripeness with with maintaining acidity is crucial for me.
So how did you know about this place? How did you know that this was the place you wanted to be?
Well, that's an interesting story.
Good.
Yeah. No, one that I was invited to come up here originally, and I can't go into details. After coming up and visiting, I met people like Nate Reddy, and I met, folks over at Analemma, and started tasting those wines, and was just absolutely mesmerized that was coming out of, like the Analemma sparkling wine. They're the Blanc de Noir that they had made from out of his vineyard. I think is one of I think it's the best sparkling wine I've ever had from America. I saw the possibility here. I saw the climate. It's just like energetically to be somewhere that's up and coming, and you can tell like there's something special here. Like it's just obvious.
So tell me about finding this specific place.
Well, when I first came up here, I was farming that vineyard and a couple other vineyards around here, and I had seen this house from the very beginning and been like Wayne's World, like she will be mine. Oh yes, And I knew about the Albarino and the Gewürztraminer, and it's all rooted. And while those may not have been the varieties that I would have planted first, I was interested. It's this property in particular up here really spoke to me. And for a couple of years, I tried to figure out ways to get it. It was way more money than we realistically should have ever spent on a property, and we're still paying for that. No pun intended. I met the lady who owned it. So the story of this property is kind of sad. Well, it's extremely sad. It was bought by a husband and wife, and it had been pears. And they pulled the majority of pears, except for like about an acre down there. After planting a lot of the vineyard, he died in a tractor accident. So he was augering and had turned the PTO off on the tractor and got his leg caught in a piece of wire. And so I knew that story as well. And she was widowed with, I think, a 5 and a 7-year-old when it happened. I had reached out to her trying to see if I could lease it, and she wanted to sell it, and I wasn't in a position to really say, I can buy this property from you, but we stayed in touch. And then one day I heard she was in town because she was getting ready to sell it. There was a contract and everything that had been, it was like getting ready to be sold. And I just went and knocked at the back door, and this lady with blue hair and cut off jean shorts covered in tattoos opened the door. And I'm standing on the other side and cut off jean shorts, braids, covered in tattoos. And I was like, "Are you Lynette?" She's like, "Yeah." I was like, "I'm Laura." And she just looks at me she goes, "You want to come in for a coffee?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." And we became really good friends, and that sale ended up not materializing. And for, another almost a year, we just tried to figure out ways that I could buy this farm from her, or if, I could buy half of it, or we could split it, or what we could do. And she had offered to carry the note and all this stuff. But then what finally happened is mortgage rates got really low, and we applied and were able to get a mortgage and bought it. That's how and why this property. And Lynette and I are still super tight. When she comes out here, she can stay here if she wants. Her kids can come here. There's a memorial for her husband at the end of the property. I actually he named this, he was going to call the winery Energaia. So I called these Energaia Vineyard for him. And that's a Aristotelian term for the energy behind things. And then I named our winery Aitia, which is also an Aristotelian term for the reason behind things, kind of to stay in line with his philosophy and honor him. And, you know, the back of all of the estate wines are a dedication to him as well. It's on that one, Loving Memory of James. So, yeah, I never knew him, but there's something about farming land that somebody else farmed. You know, you kind of get to know somebody, you know, like the little nuances, the funny little tools, the projects that you find laying around, you know. It's interesting.
It's like an archive.
It is, exactly, like an archive, yeah. So I wanted to honor them, though. It felt really vital to me.
So describe the vineyards for me when you got here. What was planted and kind of what was the state it was in?
It was Albarino and Gewürztraminer, and honestly, it's not much different now than it was then. I've been here for a few years, and you know, we haven't really been in the place where we can go plant a bunch or change a bunch. And I also have this, I don't know, like, I think it's important to let nature do nature for a while. Like, I am waiting for this vineyard to show me more than I'm trying to say, you're going to be this. Yeah, and just be in harmony with it. I mean, I will plant. I haven't planted anything yet, but I intend to plant. And by the time I do plant, I'll have a few years under my belt here and have a better idea climate-wise and, you know, just energetically what's going to fit better versus just showing up and being like, okay, nature, you do what I say. You know, I can't remember who said it, but there's a quote that is, when making decisions based around nature, your first assumption should be that you're wrong. And I really, really like that.
So tell me about, now that you have a space that's yours, tell me about starting to implement your farming. You mentioned constantly experimenting, constantly trying things out. What's the long-term vision for what the vineyard will maybe look like, or maybe either from a physical standpoint or even from more of like a spiritual standpoint? What is the long-term vision for the space? I
want it to feel like you're in a forest. You know, like, I don't want you to walk into my vineyard and feel like you're in this highly organized, which no one ever would, you know, this highly organized, highly curated piece of perfection. I think that, you know, I've been having a few conversations with other regenerative farmers lately about how part of the misconception of farming, you know, and we're talking about vineyards and specifically usually, is that it has to look a certain way, and it doesn't. Like, it doesn't have to look a certain way. And actually, you shouldn't be expecting to find, you know, the grass all cut to the same level and every vine looking the same when you're in a vineyard, because they're all plants. They're individual plants. And yeah, when people walk through my vineyard, I want them to feel like it's alive. Like, I want them to feel like they can hear the, like, hissing and communicating of the plants, and that they can hear, you know, like, the vetch rattling at this time of year as the pods dry out, and, you know, smell the evening primrose, which many people hate having in their vineyard, but I can't understand why. Like, you know, I want them to take time to notice what it's like to be in nature, because it is nature. It's not simply like a homogenized construct of modernity, if that makes sense.
You talked about Aitia and releasing soon, so tell me about how that project has developed and about what's coming up.
So I made my first vintage of Aitia in 2022. Actually didn't make wine last year because of the smoke. And I, like, to be honest, the real reason I didn't make wine last year was more for, like, health reasons. But the smoke also influenced, like, by the time I would have picked what I wanted, I wouldn't have wanted to pick it necessarily. It's finally, like, I finally get to release my wine from up here. It feels so good. I'm so excited about them. I think that they absolutely tell the story that I wanted to tell when I came up here. Like, I feel like that's an interesting thing as a winemaker. Like, I don't ever feel like I'm trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. I feel like I'm trying to take something that exists and tell its story. You know, like I've used the analogy that I feel more like a house painter than a portrait painter. You know, where the house exists already, and I'm just trying to emphasize the beauty that's there versus, you know, like, oh, this is 100% my creation. I don't feel that way at all. And I feel like these wines that I'm about to release will be telling a story about this place. You know, through a very, you know, hopefully thoughtful and gentle and beautiful prism. Yeah, that's kind of what I have to say about that. You know, it's brand new, and it's not like it's not my first rodeo at this point. You know, like it's brand new, but it's also with a lot of intention and understanding and thought behind it. You know, nothing about this is unintentional. It's all been very, very, very carefully thought about. And I'm excited about that. I'm excited to see how people receive it.
So you talk about the story and about kind of sharing the story. Tell me about if someone were to taste these wines, what are the biggest things you'd want them to get from them? What are the biggest takeaways?
I mean, I always tell people, like, the only thing that really matters with wine is if you like it. Like, I don't have a, like, I don't really care about a lot of the, like, foofiness and, you know, snottiness about wine. To be honest, I hardly even drink at this point in my life. I love wine. I love drinking wine. And when I do drink wine, because I don't drink that much, I drink really good wine. And that's maybe what I want people to experience when they drink my wine, is that they feel like they're drinking something that's special. Like, they're like, oh my gosh, this is actually, like, you know, we talk about the science or the creativity or whatever, but there is alchemy in wine. There are things that we don't understand. There are wines that can take us places or make us feel things. And I want this to be one of those wines. Like, I want people to have an experience when they drink my wine. Not just be like, oh, this tastes good. But honestly, if their experience is, oh, this tastes good and I like it, that's fine. You know? So this is Pinot Gris from... oh
my God.
from the vineyard right down the hill on the corner with the pear orchard. I farmed that vineyard as well. But it's a wine of place. I've never had Pinot Gris with that much acid.
No, it's amazing. So that's kind of my next question was, you've been up here a couple of years. You had your vineyard. You've kind of named.
I moved here in 2019.
19. Okay.
Yep.
So tell me about the getting to know the place here and getting to figure out what do you want to express in a bottle, like what or what's going to be expressed in the bottle. Tell me about getting to know these grapes and about how best to express them.
I mean, it's the intensity. Like, this is such an intense. It's a beautiful, intense place surrounded by volcanoes, and I feel like the wine from up here can show that, in that it can be beautiful and lean and clean and intense and minerally. But the wine to me reflects the environment, and that it's like pristine and clean, but it's also like energetically intense and almost like... My daughter made up this word riding roller coasters recently. She was saying she gets hecked out. Hecked out. And I was like, she just made it up, and it's this term for being between excited and scary. And I kind of feel like Underwood because I'm only Underwood. Mm-hmm. I only make wine from Underwood Mountain and at the higher elevation points. I feel like these wines are that. They're like this interface of like absolute beauty and being terrifying. You know, they're intense and they're big and they're powerful, but they're also this like really clean, like lightning strike of experience.
So let's talk about kind of, I guess, long term then. What's the vision for the end of this project, or for the, not the end of this project, what's the vision for the growth of this project? What would you like to do that you haven't done yet?
Honestly, I don't want to make a lot of wine. I want to make like 2,000 cases a year. I'll probably have a little tasting room up here eventually, and have a wine club and do, private tastings a couple days a week, and have my wine club and do events that correlate with that, and get to focus on jiu-jitsu and raising my children. And I'm really into yin yoga and functional movement and working with people who've been through trauma survivors. I have a whole other side interesting story with that in my early life. And I really want to focus on, or be able to at least split my time, maybe get an acupuncture degree or something, and work with people to rehabilitate, and feel comfortable in their bodies. That's massively important for me. And the thing that I think about a lot right now is how that actually interfaces with the way I feel about farming and wine a lot. Being able to find that connection in myself, through movement, and also lack of movement through letting my body be still. Letting the land be still is important. Knowing when to move and when not to move. And I really want to help other people figure those things out as well. So if I get to have my cake and eat it too, I'll continue to make wine. Maybe I'll do some consulting for people. And I will get to, teach yin yoga and functional movement, and, help other people find themselves in their bodies, and learn that they're not broken and they can rehabilitate, just like land isn't broken and we can rehabilitate it. There's this beauty and understanding that things, even when they're really far gone, even when you're past the point of the precipice, that you can still come back, So that's, if I get to do what I want, what I'll do.
You mentioned animals as part of the system and as part of the vineyard. Tell me about getting animals introduced to this and having them be part of what you're doing here.
Ever since we moved to this property, we've had animals. So we've had goats and sheep and pigs and chickens and dogs and cats and bunnies and all sorts of stuff. And right now it's pigs and chickens, and our bunnies are pets now, and dogs. You met we have livestock guardian dogs that are just amazing. Like, we really got lucky. They were born here, those two. They're really fantastic. We had chicks that we just found out in the vineyard that one of our chickens had gone out and hatched. We found them yesterday, and, our dogs were just like, hey, there's chicks over here. And of all the animals in the world, if I was, I understand why everything eats chickens. They're just so, why would you not? If you were a dog, it takes so much dog control not to eat a chicken. And, especially a chick is just, one little bite. But yeah, they're so good, and they're great with children and people. And, the interesting thing is they kind of know when not to be. Like, if it's a coyote, it's like they know immediately and they're not playing. Or once I was out in the vineyard and I went to wrestle my partner down, and our big dog ran over it's the only time I've ever seen him do that. But it was really funny to see that personality is in there. If my kids wander anywhere on the farm, there is a 150-pound dog not more than 10 feet away, making sure they're okay. So it's really neat to live with animals in nature as well, and get to see the way that even animals that are part of your farm get to kind of be different out here. But that's the pigs, like I said, we like to get them out in the vineyard. They're naughty pigs though, and they visit the neighbors, so we have to be careful with them right now. I think the plan is we're going to end up with a lot of pork in our freezers here soon, and And we'll probably transition back to sheep because they're a little dumber.
Yeah, a lot dumber.
A lot dumber. Yeah. Yeah, I went and visited native flora recently. I don't know if you guys have ever gone down there, but his sheep, I like his sheep program because he's not rigorously moving them around or anything. He just has he puts them in one vineyard or in the other, and they're short enough that they can't cause too many problems, and I kind of like that, where it's not hyper controlled.
Last question for you then. What's your biggest accomplishment, or what are you proudest of so far?
My kids? I mean, come on. No, I have 3 amazing children. My oldest is 25. I had her when I was 15. She's a stunning human. I have my little ones who are 6 and 8, and they're just, I don't know. I mean, they're so cool. But they challenge me all the time. They definitely, I learn a lot about how to look at the world and what's important, and, when to take time, when to put my fucking phone away, how to listen, how to be an example. And, my children by far are my greatest accomplishment. I can't imagine life without them.
All right, all the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything we didn't cover today that you wanted to cover?
I feel like we got to the meat of it.
Words of wisdom?
Just be honest. I think that's the hardest thing for people and experiences, and to be honest is to be okay with failure. Because when you're being honest with yourself and with other people, you have to also acknowledge that it's not always going to render the result that you want in that moment, but in the long game of your life, it's going to render you the result that you want to live with. So, be it in a relationship or in a profession or anything else with yourself, I want to live a life that I don't say, I really wish I didn't do that, or I really wish I would have said something else. I'd rather suffer the consequences of being honest with myself and those around me.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
sharing your story with us, sharing your beautiful space with us.
Thanks for coming.
And sharing your wine with us.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to let you off the hook.
Thanks.
Thank you.